And thanks to everyone joining in. Um, Wanted to talk for a bit of time here about civil reconnaissance and about some of the issues that have been central to the conversations I've been lucky enough to take part in, working alongside the civil affairs community over the past couple of years. And at the end of 15 minutes or so, we'll open up to Q&A. I'm happy to go over a bit in terms of timing. But let's hopefully generate some discussion and take it from there. And what I really want to talk about this evening for me is, how we think about civil reconnaissance and what civil reconnaissance can do as we think about the transformation that's taking place within civil affairs. And the basic argument I want to put forward is I think civil affairs needs a signature product, a signature deliverable that every CA team every time delivers, irrespective of whatever else CA does. There has to be that one definitive thing that CA produces that defines, what this community is all about. And I think that civil reconnaissance is the process that should give rise to that deliverable, should drive that process. And I'll flesh that out a bit, pose some questions, for those of you who I haven't had the chance to meet. My background traces back to the early days of the human terrain system, principally working in Iraq. And that was a formative experience for me. And since that time, for the past dozen plus years, understanding operational environments is what I do for a living, whether it's for the U.S. military, whether it's for our foreign partners, or in the private sector. Because there are a lot of big organizations, whether you're conducting military operations or you're drilling for oil, whatever it is you're doing, these big organizations are very good typically at instilling technical skill and teaching people to perform a specific task in an organization. But where challenges arise is, how you conduct any given military operation, how you drill for oil. The realities of that day in, day out are different from Colombia to Iraq to Indonesia. And we can understand that, we can appreciate that, but the challenge is that they're different in different ways every single time. And how do we figure out, what matters in the civil environment, in the human domain and the human terrain, whatever words you want to use? That's the challenge. And that's where I think we need to talk about, focusing civil reconnaissance. And I want to kind of pull this out a little bit more. Sort of a defining early experience for me in this line of work goes back to 2008 when I first deployed to Iraq. And it was the induction brief, that my teammates and I received as part of a human terrain team from a brigade level 2 shop on the east side of Baghdad in early 2008. And it was a briefing on where we just arrived. We were fresh off a helicopter. And it's what's going on here. This is your orientation to where you're going to spend the next year of your life. And that briefing, it traced out the enemy networks, which in that time and place were the Mahdi Army, the special groups. It talked about SIGACs. It gave us a leadership tree. It talked about how governance, at least ought to be functioning in that time and place. It gave us certain metrics, etc. But what wasn't in the briefing was what jumped out the most, to our team. Was that there was nothing in that brief about why any of this was happening. And there was nothing in that brief about what it was about that area of Southeast Baghdad that made it different. And what was it about, one neighborhood to the next that made those different from one another. And, the man who gave that brief, I remember very well, was, a top end NCO who was fully aware of this. He knew that this information wasn't in there. And the Army as a whole knew that they had a blind spot, effectively, in terms of who was asking these questions and how that kind of contextual information was going to get fed into the military. And that's why, the human terrain system was created in the first place. So, we knew it was important. We knew it was key, in that time and place and in, any number of other types of operational environments. And this is civil reconnaissance, as I see it. But the challenge that we faced then, and I think that, everyone is still wrestling with, is, well, okay, how do we do this exactly? And once we have it, what do we do with it? And, thinking back to again, first cutting my teeth on this stuff in 2008. The need then was critical. The need now is still just as critical, but there are these same uncertainties around process and around method. In the here and now, I think it's awesome that CA owns this now. Outsourcing this to a contracted capability never made sense to me, just because of how important it is and how central, whatever you want to call it, civil reconnaissance, human terrain analysis is to, again, the full spectrum of operations. But the challenge is still there around this pivot from, okay, we know what we want to do, but how do we do it? And when I read first, the old coin manual that was new, circa 2006, 2007, I got a similar feeling reading the recent CA update manual, where you have this very eloquent statement of intent. Here's what we want to do, and here's why it's important. But in both of those documents, just speaking from my own perspective, I was left wondering, well, okay, but how? On a Thursday morning on the streets of East Baghdad, or in a village in Eastern Syria, or out in the Philippines, step by step by step, what do I do? And, getting to know the CA community and talking to people over the past few years, there's an abundance of success stories of teams that have gone out and figured this out and done it right. But what's concerning, again, from my perspective, is that all those stories are different. All right. And, the good news in that, all right, is that that's a testament to the talent in the CA community. All right. Time and time again, teams are being deployed with a mission, with intent, and they're figuring out how to get the job done through improvisation. You talk about operational arts. There's a lot of that in the CA community right now, which is tremendous. But what about the science of it, right? You want a balance between individual initiative and talent and creativity, but also structure and process and method. And the fact that we're all trying to figure this out in different ways at different times in different scenarios points to me to a systemic challenge, a fault. And it's the same exact one that the human terrain system wrestled with, that ultimately caused its downfall, its end. They never quite figured out process and method to reliably produce something. All right. And, I've put these statements down to be, not strident, but forward, that, from where I sit, CA doesn't really have a viable civil reconnaissance methodology. If you pick away at the doctrine, you get back to ASCOPE. Okay. Step one in the civil affairs methodology as defined in the doctrine. Step one is assess, right? Well, how? And you peel that back and you wind up back at ASCOPE time and time again. And when I say, CA is missing a viable civil reconnaissance methodology, ASCOPE is not that. It was never meant to be that. This is a method that was developed for the purposes of sort of nation state level strategic targeting, all right, to be able to look at, at the national level, systems and vulnerabilities, and then break that down more broadly into the targeting process. But we're using it now to do real investigative work on the ground in complex environments. And it wasn't built for that. And it doesn't really work that way. And, I could talk about ASCOPE, for all the time we have together today, and I won't do that. I've written about it elsewhere. But the key problem with it is that it's reductive. When you get an ASCOPE PAMISI crosswalk, you're meant to go out and look at an operational environment where all these systems are working together. They're all interacting. They're all creating second and third order effects. And you're supposed to sit down and break that into pieces and put those pieces into boxes. And, from my point of view, I see the value in it if you already know a lot about an area and you're trying to categorize that information and present it in a way that's fairly clean and concise. But that's not what civil reconnaissance is all about. That's something that happens much later. Civil reconnaissance, again, I think of it with the ethos of detective work. I'm out there, we are out there pursuing leads, following trails, digging into things. Okay, it's the detective mindset where you need a process and a method that guides you and encourage creativity and initiative. And, again, I think of ASCOPE, I think of sort of the librarian type mindset where you're at the card catalog and you're categorizing things and you're putting them into boxes. And it's not exploratory. It's not expeditionary. It's a whole different thing that has its place when we try to make sense or at least compartmentalize, boxes of information. But I don't see that as civil reconnaissance. And the conversations we've had, at the CA Association meeting in Tampa and before and after has been about the potential of civil reconnaissance to help this process CA is in the midst of to redefine itself and to recast its mission and its value proposition to the Army. And what I want to kind of close out with and put forward is that, how is the challenge? What does that look like? All right. And I don't want to sit back here and be critical because I'm very mindful. This is actually very difficult to do. The process of civil reconnaissance, of human terrain analysis, all the answers are out there. They're all readily accessible. The challenge is not that of traditional intelligence work where you're trying to find things that are hidden away. The challenge is figuring out, where do you start and what questions do I ask? All right, and how do I go about conducting an investigation that's going to be actionable at the end, that will speak to priorities? All right, and what I want to put out here is sort of a three-part statement. And you can agree with me through as many steps of this as you want, and we can pick this apart in Q&A and in onward discussion. But most critically, I think that with the position CA is in and the things that the branch is trying to do, that CA needs a core deliverable, a signature product. You can still do all the other CA things that happen, all right, but you need something that has three qualities. It's unique, so no one else is doing it. It's essential, all right, so that once people see it, they realize they can't do without it, and it's actionable. All right, to me, that's what defines a signature deliverable for civil affairs right now. All right, and the second step, I think that should come through civil reconnaissance. I think civil reconnaissance is, I don't want to use the word exciting, but it's the most engaging, it's the most expeditionary, it's the most sort of tactically oriented thing that I see CA doing. And it can be done across AOs, across situations. All right, but I think that having said that, we need to rethink how civil reconnaissance is done and do a bit of reinvention, okay? Because, fundamentally, again, I don't want to hammer on ASCOPE at too much length, but I don't think ASCOPE is a viable civil reconnaissance methodology, all right, for lots of reasons that, again, I've written about elsewhere, and I can talk about in the Q&A if someone wants to push back, all right? And secondly, we could think about redefining, a methodology to do area assessments, but I don't think an area study or an area assessment type product is the answer here. Okay, there's value in these things, right? As someone who's academically minded, I get the value of them. But in a deployed environment where teams are on the ground, an area study is not unique for the simple reason that there are, dozens of think tanks, of government agencies, of universities, et cetera, of partner forces that are producing these kinds of documents. Okay, are they essential? You can debate that. The problem is, if you're going to do an area study right, you're talking again about tens and tens and tens of pages, a great deal of work, a great deal of time invested for what will wind up inevitably being a sizable document. And in that deployed environment, is that something that a commander is going to see as essential? I can sit here and say I've written lots of long documents that I thought were essential, that captured something fundamental. But ultimately, how many people read them? All right, and how do you get something that reaches your audience? And lastly, we can talk about replacing ASCOPE with something else, but area studies are rarely actionable, in a tactical environment. Their context, their background, and from my point of view, an area study type document is something you look at before a deployment and you work on after a deployment, right? And I can see a place like SWCC becoming, we talked about, librarians, a library, a repository of incredibly valuable documents that are maintained and updated by the CA community on any number of geographies around the world. I think there is a place for that kind of area study product, but I don't think it's what CA needs to kind of sell itself. And again, what I'd offer up as a solution is to reframe civil reconnaissance, not around geography, but around an enemy, around a threat, around a network. And what this would be, again, an analytical bridge from the two's view of an enemy. So think of the network-centric, targeting paradigm, where the two was focused on this vision of an enemy network. And what we want to do with what I would call a network route map is map out the when, where, how, and why of how that network, that we're supposed to call them competitors now, I guess. I'm trying to keep up with the jargon, but how that competitor has sunk roots, neighborhood to village to town, all across a given area of operations. All right, that I think is a civil reconnaissance product. It's definitely in CA's lane. I know we can talk maybe about the relationship between the 2 and the 9 and the sensitivities there. But I think that this is something that would be unique because the 2 isn't doing this right now. All right, it would be essential. And once people saw these products and they saw what it gave them, that people would want more of this. Right? Commanders would demand this. Right? And finally, they're actionable. This feeds directly into the targeting process. This is a targeting product that joins up the lethal and the non-lethal sides, which again, at present, I think are stovepiped a whole lot more than they should be. Right? So you're generating a whole lot of effects by producing this. Because again, I referenced it earlier, you're compensating for what I see as a structural problem in this network targeting paradigm, where the 2 was viewing the Islamic State, Boko Haram, or Russia's proxy networks in eastern Ukraine, like a molecule. Okay, you map out a network, you connect the nodes, you understand its shape, and you develop lines of attack against that network. The problem with that, all right, and the reason I think that we struggle to translate incredible skill at network targeting into real results, is that it's a limited way, an incomplete way of looking at a network. That we're not looking at a molecule that exists in suspension. Okay, and the metaphor I try to use with this is think about it as a tree. The network diagram we get in Palantir or Analyst Notebook gives you the limbs and the branches, and you can hack away at those through all kinds of means. But you're missing that root structure. And that's why when we hack away at the Taliban, for example, they regenerate. Think of the targeting campaigns that we've brought to bear in Afghanistan for 20 years now. Where has it gotten us? A part of the problem there, beyond big picture politics, I think is this flawed view of the targeting process right now on the lethal side. And we would be compensating for that by providing that root structure and by explaining the where, when, how, and why of local connectivity. And once you've done that, and I'll end here and I'll turn it over to questions, is that once you've mapped these routes, you're not at the end of civil reconnaissance, right? And for those of you who might be concerned that we're really shutting off, broad avenues that civil reconnaissance ought to explore, right? This is the starting point. You have this route structure, all right? And you can follow that in any direction, all right? That gives you a starting point of where to look, which is the hardest part in civil reconnaissance. I said, the Iraqis are, engaging with these concepts and their intelligence capabilities, all right? And they have, again, tremendous local knowledge, all right? But it's to the point that it's overwhelming. Because if you take intelligence officers who know Mosul like the back of their hand and tell them to produce civil reconnaissance products, they could sit there and write for years. But to what end? How much of it's going to be actionable? Where do you start and how do you prioritize your efforts? And that's what I think this route structure would give you. So in that scenario, you're looking at the Islamic State's route structure into the neighborhoods of Mosul and into the surrounding countryside. What did that look like? How did that happen? And then beyond that, what were the local contextual factors, social, economic, political, cultural, tribal, etc., that gave rise to the route structure looking the way that it does. And here, you're well beyond products that are interesting or nice to know. Again, in my line of work, interesting is a death sentence. If I deliver something and the feedback is, hey, that was interesting, I've missed, I've failed. And this is, I think, a way for a civil reconnaissance, initiative or effort to get beyond that and to deliver something that I think could really go a long way toward, reshaping the CA brand. So, thank you for listening to me. I can see some questions popping up. And Doug, if you want to pick one or two to get things going, I'll open up the line and I'll start looking at these questions myself.
All right.
But again,
Sounds
thank
good.
you very much. And I'll end saying that we'll share these slides around, early next week. And my contact information is there if you want to violently disagree or agree, or whatever the case might be. I look forward to talking to whomever wants to talk.
Thank you, Nick. I'll just start at random some of the questions we have here. Agree, most commanders do not have a consistent CA product in mind. If it is possible to develop a signature product, it will overlap with intelligence requirements and feed into a non-lethal targeting process. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is part of the issue, is that people, as I've understood the debate within the CA community, is commanders aren't sure what to expect from CA teams. They don't quite know what to ask of them. And my view, again, is that CA should be defining itself proactively. Now, I understand how information requirements are tasked down. I understand, again, the I don't say politics involved, but the processes involved and the systems involved. But I think that this is the kind of product that will sell itself in a way. And as we start to develop these products and get these things out there, supply can create demand, if you will. And of course, there's a measure of kind of interpersonal finessing and relationship management to be done. And, you certainly don't want to come in and step on the toes of the two. But again, this isn't, as I understand it, this really isn't on their radar right now. This isn't something they're trying to push into. And I would think that it's sort of ostensibly valuable enough and complementary enough that it would create opportunities and help create additional information requirements so that CA is more in demand as opposed to less.
A comment here, like the concept of uniform deliverable. USACES does this and everyone knows exactly what they will get from an engineer assessment, regardless if it's a bridge, a route, or seawall. I think that's a good way of looking at that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, this is, I hope I didn't sound, critical of the CA enterprise opening this up. I wanted to define a problem statement, all right? And, having worked on this exact problem set, more or less around the world, no one's gotten to perfect. And very few people have gotten even to pretty good in terms of a systematic, reliable, scalable capability that does more or less the same kind of thing every time. Civil reconnaissance, human terrain analysis, pretty much wherever you go is defined by, again, operational art, by initiative, by personal talent. Right? And, that level of personal talent can create tremendous results. But again, it's not a solution. It's not an organizational solution. Right? And I talked, comparing a bit, my experience of the human terrain system to where CA is now. I can even think of company commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan. The ones who were, controlling a piece of terrain, who really excelled, were the ones who did this kind of work of their own initiative in their spare time, which really didn't exist, and who went the extra mile to figure this out through whatever methods they had at their disposal. Now, again, the fact that happened frequently is a testament to the talent in the military, right? But it's also, again, it exposes, I think, a systemic problem in the military, where something that important can't be left to chance, to just initiative alone. You don't want to stomp out initiative. You want to maintain them. That's, again, part of the problem I have with ASCOPE and these kinds of methods that are reductive, that don't really encourage intellectual curiosity and exploration, right? You want to harness that creativity within a framework, within, again, a process and a method that has structure, but that isn't stifling. Because, you can consistently deliver a bridge, right? How do you, because a bridge is a bridge, and statement of the obvious, right? But the engineering requirements are objective and straightforward, but we're deep into subjectivity and uncertainty and complexity here. So you really have to compensate, I think, with the science to balance the art in terms of how we execute on the ground. So thank you for the question. I'm trying to skim through it. Doug, if you want to fire another one off, I'm looking.
Going through this that come in. I like the concept of an overlay, i.e. a civil MCOO that IDs civil obstacles, opportunities, threats, etc. Yes, a MCOO is a combined obstacle overlay developed by an engineer tree analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to get all the acronyms here. Yeah, I mean, and again, threats, opportunities, a SWOT analysis type approach can be integrated into this. The challenge is just to make sure that there's something consistent, all right? And there's something consistent that can integrate. And you talk about an overlay, okay? And there have been, comments about, well, how do we integrate this into the PIR process and all the rest of it? I'm, again, cognizant of that. In a way, we're kind of backing into something that's bigger than just CA, and that gets into the broader intelligence process, the intelligence cycle. Is, how do we view an operational environment? How do we view an enemy? How do we view, the civil domain, human terrain, whatever you want to call it? Right now, we're very stovepiped from an analytical standpoint. You have different groups of people in different physical locations asking different kinds of questions that in reality are all interconnected. And when I talk about, adding this contextual layer to the network-based targeting process, that does in a way go beyond just CA. And we're getting into an area where we're trying to change how the military thinks about, who it's fighting and where we're fighting. And again, I'm mindful of taking on more than we want to chew. But there's an approach here of just honestly doing it and showing the results, as opposed to getting into, a wider doctrinal argument or structural argument, to send teams out there and do this work, and let the results stand for themselves. Because at present, no one else is doing this. And again, it's a chicken and egg argument, but I think the best way to advance the cause of, integrated analysis feeding into a more integrated targeting process, is to lead by example and to show what this looks like. So yeah, again, it is beyond just CA, but that doesn't mean CA can't take the lead and take the initiative on this right now.
Along that effort, I'll take a couple more. I'll try to pull a couple more out here. This discussion currently is framed tactically until we, big we, recognize this is part of addressing line of effort 2, NDS gray zone operations, well in advance of actual operations or during prep of the environment. What is your recommendation to elevate this conversation to a level where it can actually impact, if retained in big Army, it will always be an afterthought?
Yeah, I get it. And, in my time in a tactical environment, I never really saw evidence of the feedback loop that's supposed to exist, right? So in theory, tactical level detail gets kicked back up and informs strategic planning. The human terrain system as conceived was supposed to do that. Right? It was supposed to find, ground level, street corner type context, feed that into, the system, which would then in turn get kicked up and inform strategy. And the human terrain system was built as a strategic capability that conducted tactical operations. Again, the problem in my experience was that feedback loop doesn't happen fast enough. So, as a tactical level element on the ground, plans have been made well in advance, right? And so if you want to come back, and this happened time and again, and say, listen, to a brigade commander, we're trying to do X. So the Sons of Iraq program or our SERP initiatives, tribal mobilization. We could point to reasons why this was not going to work in our particular area. Not to say it's not a strategic objective worth pursuing nationwide, but it wasn't going to work in our area. And we could clearly explain why, without a shadow of doubt. There was no prospect of adapting strategy or informing the strategic planning process. The best we could do really was sort of operational level expectation management, all right, to sit down at brigade level and explain why this thing we had to do wasn't really going to work, or to anticipate second and third order effects and try to manage that and do it the best way we can, kind of adapt it as we could within the boundaries we had to be a more efficient solution. Now, that is in a way, very much a kind of global war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan mindset. And as we think about, looking ahead to different environments where we're not in the middle of a massive long-term campaign, where you have civil affairs teams operating, all around the world without these immediate strategic pressures to deliver products and deliver results on a very tactically minded timetable, whether that's driven by military priorities or political imperatives. This is reality. I think CA has a bit of space, let's say right now, breathing room, to go out and proactively produce products like this in an operational environment or within an operational tempo that can be conducive to that. That's going to vary one place to the next. That's not uniformly true. But I think it's doable. And I think it's the right time to have at it. So yeah, thank you.
We'll wrap up with a final question. And just for everybody's information, we're going to package this up after this. We'll take all the comments and questions and put them together, and we'll give Nick a chance to go through them one by one and formulate some of his thoughts and send out to everybody. But the last question I'll throw at you, Nick, is using the same metaphor of roots, trees. The next question is, what will the tree/forest look like in 5 to 15 years, as well as what is the need for certain trees to grow?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, and a good one. I mean, you have to take it, tree by tree, if you will, network by network. So you think about the Islamic State. This was something that had been hacked away, down to more or less a stump from an external viewpoint, looking above the ground. But you can watch it regenerate already. And with the problems the Iraqi government's having, a very tenuous situation in Syria, they have space right now. They have breathing room of their own to tap into that root structure. And if you think about it, again, we're kind of getting into some off-the-cuff strategic forecasting. But if you can imagine, think about what's happening right now in the world. If you can imagine governments across the Middle East, North Africa, down into the Sahel, trying to contend with, pandemic impacts, and probably more importantly, trying to contend with the paralysis of the global economy, the withering of aid money. They've got locust famines in the Horn of Africa. If it's not one thing, it's the next right now. So if you can imagine an environment where state control is weakened and international assistance is pulled back, there's an amazing opportunity to grow roots if you're a non-state actor. And in the same breath, thinking about, state level adversaries, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, it's a great time to mobilize proxies, because that's a strategy where you can get a sizable return on a pretty modest investment. Iran has shown that, probably most poignantly in the Middle East, where they've provided some very limited assistance to a pretty, I say mediocre, a pretty unformidable series of networks in Iraq, for example. Small organizations with very minimal or very modest popular appeal. Not the Sadr movement, not what was the Mahdi army, but these small splinter factions. And they have a stranglehold on Iraqi politics as a result. They're shaping the whole discussion around the U.S. presence in Iraq, where we've spent years investing time and resources and lives. So yeah, I mean, if you think about a near-term landscape of states losing their grip, of economic uncertainty, it creates tremendous opportunity for our competitors, our enemies, to grow these kinds of routes. And when you think about how we care for the forest, I think it's a time for us to do the same thing, and to take a hard look at what sort of expeditionary activity overseas looks like. Is it driven by state to state, military to military type aid? To a certain extent, it always will be in some measure. But what about state to non-state, quasi-proxy type aid? Are there opportunities for us to grow local networks and cultivate local networks and to sink some roots of our own? In that kind of scenario, the world gets very complicated, and strategic intelligence requirements become very granular, very localized. And if that is the future we're heading for, it's a hell of a time to be CA. Talk about an essential capability, because who else does that? Who else looks at that? That's a CA mission. That's civil reconnaissance, and that's really what I want to kind of hammer on here with this concept. That I think it's not an end state, but it's a step in the right direction that I think can frame a lot of the other things that CA is trying to do, and can put CA in a position to not have to sell itself. All right, to be welcomed into the door, to be invited into the door, where you show up and you present deliverables that people already know about and already want, and the conversation goes from there. So yeah, it's a good question, and it's a bit of a grim future, but I think that's where we're headed.
I'll wrap up before I turn it over to you for final comments with a statement or comment made in here by Dennis Cahill. I think the community will be pleasantly surprised with the outcome of the CEA Force Modernization Assessment, which touches on these lessons presented by Nick today. The proponent still has the challenges integrating these lessons with big Army thinking for working this with, as we speak, and multiple How the Army Fights working groups, which started a few weeks ago and continue for weeks to come. So that's obviously good news. And Nick, again, we truly appreciate your time today. We appreciate everybody that's online. We had over 113 people join us. So obviously this is a topic of interest. Thank you for staying up late. It's what, about 9:30 your time in Switzerland. So yeah, a little towards the evening, putting the kids down to bed. Any final comments before to wrap up?
Yeah, I just would thank Dennis for his comment. It's a great note to close on. I spent most of my time talking about the difficulties in doing this right. And I think it's tremendous that, this sort of overhaul is happening right now, and it's coming to fruition, at an opportune moment, I think, to engage with this landscape that I think we're headed into. Because, for all the challenges, I think this is the best job in the world, where you can combine, initiative and intellectual curiosity and fortitude to just get out and solve problems and figure out what's happening in the world. So again, to all those in the community, I commend you for what you're doing. And yeah, thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk a bit. And I look forward to engaging whoever had questions that didn't get answered. I'll have the chat transcripts, and feel free to follow up by email. You'll get the slides and my contact information early next week. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the balance of your Friday. And yeah, thanks so much, guys. All the best.
Thanks, Dick. We appreciate it. Everybody that joined us today, Thordor Effects, I really appreciate your being part of this conversation. Have a good and safe distancing weekend, and wash your hands out here.